Girona,
Yeah.
but we have to see.
Right.
And this one, and the one with the walk, yeah, it's continuing and has lots of students.
Yeah.
See? Vale. Vale, llavors aquí... Vale, okay. Then I will pass it. So, good morning. Thank you for joining us here in Girona or even online in this special day for all of us. So first of all, I would like also to say Happy New Year and to wish you all a successful 2022 and at least a healthy 2022. So we are very happy to have with us Professor Greg Richards in this event that is organized together with the UNESCO Chair of Cultural Policies and Cooperation and the Chair on Gastronomy, Culture and Tourism of Calonge-St.Antoni. I will explain you how it will work. I will do a short presentation. Afterwards, I will give the word to Dolors Vidal, the Director of the Chair of Gastronomy, Culture and Tourism. She will do a presentation in Catalan. And afterwards, we will give the floor to our invited Professor Greg Richards, and I remember that the session will be in English. And at the end, if you want, we can have time for questions, even here in the room or even online. So the ones that are joining online, if you have questions, you can write it on the chat box of YouTube, and we're going to transmit it to Professor Richards. So Professor Greg Richards is Professor of Placemaking and Events at the Breda University and Professor of Leisure Studies at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands. He has worked on projects for numerous national governments, national tourism organizations and municipalities, and he has extensive experience in tourism and leisure research and education. So he has lots of publications, and probably most of you have read some of his papers. His recent publications include the SAI Handbook of New Urban Studies with John Hannigan, Reinventing the Local in Tourism with Paolo Russo, Small Cities with Big Dreams, Creative Placemaking and Branding Strategies with Lillian Dwiff, and Rethinking Cultural Tourism. So he has been involved in the development and evaluation of a number of major event-led cultural regeneration programs, including the European Capitals of Culture and the Hieronymus Bosch 500th Anniversary Program. He has completed several major research projects on the relationship between culture and tourism, including reports for the OECD on the impact of culture and tourism in 2009, and the tourism and the creative economy in 2014. And he has collaborated with the UNWTO on the report on tourism and culture synergies on 2008. And he is actively involved in the development of creative tourism initiatives in different parts of the world. So we are very happy to have Professor Richards with us here in Girona. So before giving the floor to him, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Dolors Vidal.
En primer lloc, desitjar-vos a tots molt bon any, saludar els presents i els que estan connectats per streaming. Sigueu tots molt benvinguts. Avui a la Facultat de Turisme de la Universitat de Girona i les Càtedres de Gastronomia, Cultura i Turisme i la de la UNESCO de Polítiques Culturals que dirigeix la doctora Sílvia Olet tenen el plaer de convocar-vos per dialogar amb Greg Richards. Benvinguts de part del nostre degà, el doctor Joaquim Major, i de l'alcalde de l'Ajuntament de Calonge i Sant Antoni, patrocinador de la Càtedra de Gastronomia, Cultura i Turisme i d'aquest acte. Estem especialment contents de poder comptar amb la presència de Greg Richards perquè el seu paper ha estat pioner en el turisme cultural i ha ajudat a molts altres estudiants i investigadors a veure una oportunitat per aprofundir en aquest espai. Els seus estudis també han estat rellevants en el treball del grup de recerca del SGR, Laboratori Multidisciplinar Recerca Turística, i també a molts de vosaltres, estudiants de doctorat i estudiants de màster o exestudiants. La seva influència ha estat i és molt gran en el camp de la recerca en turisme. La Universitat de Girona, com sabem, compta amb un màster oficial de turisme cultural i Greg Richards ha estat un referent indiscutible en els nostres estudis. És un acadèmic molt productiu i, sens dubte, la seva producció ha fet avançar els estudis en moltes altres branques i ha incentivat la producció, l'estudi, la controvèrsia i les ganes d'ampliar la discussió en aquest camp tan apassionant del turisme. Podeu seguir perfectament la seva activitat a través, per exemple, del Google Acadèmic, ja sabeu que té moltíssimes citacions, i les altres plataformes que recullen els seus articles. L'hem convidat aquí, aquest començament d'any, per dialogar, debatre amb ell el present i el futur del turisme cultural i les seves oportunitats. Avui i per streaming s'han connectat estudiosos i professionals dels 5 continents. Actualment, tal com us ha dit Sílvia Olet, Greg Richards és professor de la Universitat de Breda i professor d'estudis sobre el lleure a la Universitat de Tilburg, als Països Baixos. Ha treballat per a nombrosos projectes de governs nacionals, organitzacions turístiques nacionals i municipis i té una àmplia experiència en recerca i educació en lleure i turisme. Bé, ha participat en el desenvolupament i l'avaluació d'una sèrie de grans programes de regeneració cultural dirigits per esdeveniments com ara les capitals europees de la cultura i aquest programa meravellós del 500 aniversari de Hieronymus Boscus, tan conegut el Bosc. Bé, no me vull allargar sobre el seu currículum, que ja l'ha explicat la Sílvia Olet, però sí que volia fer referència a un estudi pioner dels anys 90-92 sobre el mercat del turisme que va fer Europa i que ha generat el projecte Atlas, que també coneixeu molt de vosaltres, perquè gràcies a aquest primer estudi preliminar que ell va fer i que s'ha publicat i que cada any anualment ha anat refent les dades i que tenim també a disposició a la nostra biblioteca, gràcies a aquest estudi molts governs i països se'n van adonar de la realitat del seu posicionament en relació al turisme cultural i evidentment el cas d'Espanya no va ser una excepció. Espanya l'any 2000 va encarregar un estudi que el va fer Xias Marketing per veure quina posició tenia tot el territori espanyol en relació al turisme cultural. I allà es va veure una gran quantitat de dèficits estructurals, de com es havia projectat una imatge molt poc cultural, com la clientela internacional no veia Espanya en una visió preferent i menys Catalunya en relació a això, i per tant en aquest estudi que va començar ell, gràcies a això es van corregir moltes polítiques. Va augmentar la dedicació a l'estudi, a la recerca, a la difusió, a la, diguem-ne, planificació sobre aquest tipus de turisme i els últims 20 anys la feina que han fet aquestes polítiques i aquests països són evidents. Crec que això també és un deute que tenen els països i les polítiques de Greg Richards en aquest sentit. I que sense aquest treball previ tothom parlava de turisme cultural però ningú tenia dades específiques i coherents sobre el que passava. Moltíssimes gràcies, Greg, per ser aquí i ja, sense allargar-me més, gràcies als assistents, gràcies també als que esteu seguint en streaming, ja li passo la paraula.
Project. Hopefully it's now working. That's great. Okay. Well, never mind. That was just the fun introduction. Because of the fact that I've been here many times talking about cultural tourism, what I thought I would do is to take a slightly different approach, particularly in the context that we're working in now with the pandemic. here we are sitting in this wonderful sitting with masks on, and many people are not able to be here because they have COVID at the moment. So this is an interesting moment in terms of the pandemic. But also what happened just before the pandemic, where we were involved in this discourse about over-tourism. Personally, I don't like that term, and as I'll explain during this presentation, I don't think it accurately reflects what is actually going on. But certainly there were debates about the numbers of tourists, the style of tourism, and how cities like Girona and Barcelona can deal with the numbers of tourists that were turning up before the pandemic. So this created interesting debates which have now seemingly disappeared because of the pandemic, but I think it won't be long before these issues resurface. So now I think is a good moment to be thinking about these things and how we can deal with the development of cultural tourism and tourism in general going forward. So I'll talk briefly this morning about how cultural tourism has grown before the pandemic, and I will focus on the growth of cultural tourism in Barcelona because I know it well and I have lots of data which I will share with you, and I will think about why the relationship between tourism and the city of Barcelona changed at a certain point, and I'll be asking the question, is it really about tourism, or are there also other things at play? And I will argue at the end that really we are dealing with a very complex situation in which ideas like over-tourism are an oversimplification. So if we look at the global cultural tourism market, what we see is basically continuous growth of cultural tourism demand from the late 1980s onwards. So in 2017 we estimated that there were over 500 million international cultural tourists traveling globally during that year. And basically cultural tourism was seen as an important segment of international tourism. It has been talked about as constituting 40% of the international tourism market for decades. That was confirmed by UNWTO research in 2018. So it is a big and important market. But unfortunately, people talk about cultural tourism without necessarily knowing the details of what is going on in that market. And that is a very important point to consider as a starting point. If we look at how cultural tourism has grown, there have been a number of key factors which have led to this growing cultural tourism market. Interestingly, one of the key factors is an increased supply of culture. I mean, this may not seem obvious, but if you look at the number of museums and monuments that have been opened or expanded in recent years, in the last 30 years or so, there is an enormous increase in the capacity of places to provide cultural experiences. And part of this is to do with tourism. It's about catering to tourism demand, providing experiences of culture that are engaging for people. But part of it, of course, is not to do with tourism at all. It's to do with culture. It's to do with people expressing their identity, displaying their tangible and intangible culture to local people and also to visitors. So there are now a lot more museums, there are a lot more monuments, and therefore there are a lot more tourists visiting those places as well. I was at the MOCO in Barcelona last week, which is a new contemporary art museum dedicated to street art, so things like Banksy, for example. So it's a new type of museum, but interestingly it piggybacks on the traditional high culture tourism market of Barcelona because it's right next to the Picasso Museum. And that positioning is no accident. They know that they will get an overspill of cultural tourists from the Picasso Museum coming to the new MoCA Museum. So there are new museums opening all the time, and this is driving an increase in cultural tourism. In society at large, education levels are increasing as well, and increased education gives you more cultural capital and therefore a greater capacity to consume culture and to do cultural tourism. So this has been a major driver in recent decades. And of course, what has been important for many cities and regions is that governments have seen culture as not just a way of educating people, but also as an economic engine. So culture has become a provider of jobs, a generator of income, and so on. So this is one of the major reasons why public sector funding is still going into museums and galleries in a big way, and we're seeing new museums and galleries opening also after the pandemic. So in spite of the fact that museums basically all closed down during the pandemic, now we're seeing museums opening again, we're seeing new museums coming on stream, and this is very much about their economic impact as well as their cultural impact. And what is also important, but sometimes forgotten, is that at a kind of ideological level, cultural tourism is viewed as a good form of tourism. Cultural tourism is the form of tourism that you want to have, whereas maybe sun, sea and sand tourism is not so desirable. And that's been a discourse which has been very important in Spain and also in other countries. This idea goes back a long way because it first emerged in the work of Picard in relation to Bali, where he countered arguments at that time about the negative effects of tourism by saying, well, cultural tourism is different because it supports local culture as well as generating money for the tourist industry. And this idea became a kind of ideology within the World Tourism Organization, for example, but also something which was spread much more widely. And so the idea was, let's develop cultural tourism because that's a good form of tourism to develop because it supports culture as well as the economy. So this has also led to the growth of cultural tourism because more and more places have specific policies which are designed to support the growth of cultural tourism. And the idea of cultural tourism being a good form of tourism is because it attracts the right kind of tourists. And the right kind of tourists, of course, are people who are highly educated and who will therefore respect culture, is the idea. And also because they spend more money. So on average, we saw from the latest research that we've been doing, even during the pandemic, that people who see themselves as cultural tourists spend 22% more than other tourists. So if you are a policymaker, clearly this is an attractive market. It is going to inject more money into your economy, and therefore these are the kinds of people that you want, rather than people who are trying to travel as cheaply as possible. So cultural tourism is extremely attractive as a market to develop. And arguably, this cultural and economic benefit of cultural tourism provides considerable synergies, positive benefits, because culture requires a market. I mean, people in the cultural sector don't often like to hear it, but without visitors, without people coming to see culture, museums are basically without a function. So you need a market for culture. And tourism provides a market for much of the culture that we have. And at the same time, tourism needs culture to provide diversity, to provide engagement. So there is a mutual benefit from bringing culture and tourism together, which is also used as an argument for developing cultural tourism. And these synergies are evident in recent studies that have been carried out about the cultural vitality of cities. So the European Cultural Cities Monitor, for example, provides a lot of detailed data about the relationship between cities and culture, and it also looks at the relationship between culture and tourism. And what we see if we look at those data is that having museums is positively related to the number of tourism overnights. So cities that have more museums attract more tourists. So that's a clear benefit for cities that have lots of museums. Concerts and shows and theatres are also positively related to tourism. So it's not just tangible cultural heritage, but also living culture as well, which can attract tourists. And the number of museum visitors is even more highly correlated with tourism overnights. So tourists drive visits to museums, and there is also a positive correlation between tourism, the number of overnight stays, and satisfaction with cultural facilities. So this idea that there are positive synergies between tourism and culture in cities is also supported by the data that we have. And Barcelona has used these synergies to good effect. And if you look at cultural tourism in Barcelona, that's really a part of this Barcelona model. This model of using culture as an engine, not just for the economy, but also as a means of developing identity for the city, identity for Catalonia, and doing that on the basis of iconic attractions, not just high culture, but also contemporary culture. There was a flood of new museums in the 1980s and the 1990s once democracy had been restored. And this was centrally about establishing the cultural identity of the city, but it also had this positive side effect of providing a basis for cultural tourism. And as the cultural life of Barcelona resurged in the 1980s and the 1990s, we also got a flood of new and restored events that brought living culture into the streets of the city. And Barcelona is a great place to visit, a great place to live in, also because there is so much culture going on in the street. And one of the things that you often find with tourists in Barcelona is that they encounter culture by accident. They walk around the corner and there are castellers building a human castle. And this is something that you find in Barcelona perhaps to a greater extent than in many other cities, because culture is also lived on the street as well as in the museum, and this makes the whole city an engaging cultural environment. Support for culture and the development of tourism has also been provided by extensive public-private partnership. So it's not just the government funding museums, but it's also the private sector putting in money for cultural development, for tourism development, and so on. So we have a system in which Barcelona's development model has stimulated cultural tourism in particular because it is based on cultural identity and because it's based on developing the economy, and these two things can be provided by the synergies of cultural tourism. So we have seen a significant development in the last 4 or 5 decades of cultural attractions, cultural icons in Barcelona, and this has driven the growth of tourism. It's interesting to look at the background to the cultural attractions in Barcelona, because a large proportion of the visits that are generated by cultural attractions in Barcelona are attributable to three people: Gaudí, Picasso and Miró. In particular, Gaudí, of course, because the Sagrada Familia keeps on attracting more and more and more people every year, and people keep coming back because it's still not finished. So you can see a different cathedral every time you visit. So there are some key cultural icons which have been built up by Barcelona. Gaudí was virtually unknown before the 1980s outside Catalonia, but he was picked up and projected as an international icon, which has been extremely successful. So Gaudí is now one of the pillars of cultural tourism in Barcelona, but Barcelona has also been very successful in levering other elements of its cultural fabric to attract people. And of course the interesting thing is that the museum of FC Barcelona is also counted in the cultural attraction visits because it is a museum. So this is an interesting point about the increasingly vague boundaries of culture that we are engaged in studying cultural tourism. People who visit the Barça Stadium are also cultural tourists, we could argue. So there has been a considerable growth in visits to museums and monuments in Barcelona, and very importantly, 3/4 of the museum visitors are international. So in other words, without the tourists, you would find it very difficult to support this weight of cultural institutions in the city. So tourism provides a direct economic support for tourism, and tourist visitors are very important to the cultural life of the institutions in Barcelona. At the same time, this use of culture to develop tourism is also a means of projecting the identity of Barcelona, the identity of Catalonia. And there's a very interesting paper written by Vargas in 2015 which analyzes this long-standing relationship between tourism and Catalan identity. It's not just something which has emerged in the last few years. It has been used for decades. And many of the what we see as very old buildings in Ciutat Vella, for example, they were restored in the early 20th century, also with the idea of attracting tourists. So cultural tourism is not new. The projection of Catalan identity through cultural tourism is also not new. And cultural tourism is used by the institutions, by the Generalitat, by the Ajuntament, and by the tourism organisations to support tourism and at the same time to support the identity of the city and of Catalonia as a whole. So people are convinced that tourism is a good thing, or they were convinced that tourism is a good thing also for culture. So that also provides an important support for cultural tourism. The current debate is not so much, I would argue, about tourism per se, but about the distribution of the benefits from the Barcelona model of cultural tourism, or tourism in general. And really we can identify a change in people's attitudes towards not just tourism but also cultural tourism in the last few years, and this is where the concept of over-tourism stems from. Some people have traced the idea of over-tourism back to as early as 2016 was one study I've seen. In fact, over-tourism stems from the 1990s. The term was first coined in Dutch by Miriam Janssen-Verbeeker, who was studying the city of Bruges at that time, where she talked about over-touristification in Bruges. So it's not a new idea, in fact, but it has become high profile because of the current issues that we're talking about. So there are now a substantial minority of people in Europe who think that the number of tourists visiting certain areas represents a threat to Europe's cultural heritage. So there has been a change in this idea that we had a few years ago about cultural tourism being predominantly a good form of tourism. So what changed in this situation? Well, I mean, clearly the images that we've seen, or at least before the pandemic, that we saw of hordes of tourists in Venice, in trying to take a picture of the Mona Lisa over the heads of other tourists, crowds in Barcelona, in lots of different places. This provides a picture of overcrowding, which is clearly not good for the city centres concerned, but also not good for the tourist experience. Do you really get a good impression of the Mona Lisa if you are seeing it in this kind of context? So increasing numbers of tourists are certainly an issue in many places, and Barcelona is no exception to this trend. So if we look at the number of overnights, basically there was a trebling in the number of overnights between 1997 and 2019 in the city. There was only a slight dip in 2008 and 2009, which corresponds to the previous economic crisis, but there was a very strong rebound after that. So there has been a fairly steady growth in tourism to Barcelona, as in many other places. Barcelona is not really exceptional in that respect. And this really began to take off around the turn of the millennium. And in the research that Atlas has been doing on cultural tourism, one of the questions that we ask people is, which cities do you think would be best for a cultural tourism visit? And around the turn of the millennium, Barcelona was really the trendy place to visit. Also Lisbon was up there. And so, if you like, new cultural destinations in Europe began to emerge at about this time. And some of the more classic cultural tourism destinations, such as Florence, Athens, London, Paris, Rome, declined as trendy places to visit. So there was a kind of change in the feel to the kind of ranking of cultural tourism destinations 20 years ago or so. So this was an important factor stimulating the growth of cultural tourism in Barcelona. But also, just after the turn of the millennium, we had a project which was supposed to be a kind of follow-up to the very successful 1992 Olympic Games in Barcelona. The Forum in 2004 was an event which was supposed to celebrate cultural diversity and sustainability. And it was also an interesting urban development project in that it took place at Diagonal Mar, so at the end of the Diagonal, which was the only bit of Cerdà's plan for Barcelona which hadn't really been completed. And so it was supposed to finish the development of Barcelona. So they had a lot of interesting cultural things going on. They invited a lot of eminent thinkers along to talk about culture and cultural diversity and all those kind of things. But what they forgot to do was to engage the local population. So here you had a massive development. It was promoted as the second largest square in the world after Tiananmen Square. So it was a big thing, but the locals didn't really engage with it. One of the reasons they didn't engage with it is because they had to pay 20 euros to get in, which is an enormous amount for lots of people in Barcelona. One of the things that also annoyed a lot of people was that you weren't allowed to bring your own sandwiches. So that made the visit even more expensive. There was an artist who protested about this by wrapping himself in aluminium foil, because that's the way that people carry their bocadillos in Barcelona. So he wrapped himself in aluminium foil to symbolize a sandwich, and tried to get into the forum dressed as a sandwich, and they did refuse him entry because he was a sandwich and therefore not allowed in. So this lack of engagement and lack of sensitivity meant that there was a lot of opposition to the forum, and the poster that we see here with the play on the Catalan word for a joint, Forum Barcelona instead of Forum Barcelona, is this idea of this is kind of bread and circuses being offered as a pacifier to the population instead of real culture, instead of real investment, instead of real jobs, and all of these things. And so the forum was certainly not as much of a success as the Olympics. An interesting Time Out cover from 2008 also captured the changing mood in Barcelona. And this is an interesting one because it talks about how to spend 24 hours without meeting tourists. And this was designed as a guide for local people who wanted to avoid the tourists. So this gives us an idea that the atmosphere was changing, that there were people in the city who were increasingly anti-tourism and were looking to get away from the many tourists who were turning up. And the Mexican hat, of course, is the classic souvenir that you will see in many of the souvenir shops in Barcelona, which of course has nothing to do with Barcelona or Catalan culture or anything else local. So it's also the idea that the culture was being commodified and globalized in an insensitive way. And one saw signs of anti-tourism sentiment appearing in different places in the city. This is a piece of graffiti which was put up near Park Güell, where you also had some squatters who decided that they would protest about attempts to dislodge them and to link this to the growth of tourism. So they thought, their view was that they were being kicked out in order to provide accommodation for wealthy tourists and rich people. So you began to see more and more signs of this kind of sentiment appearing in different parts of the city. And in terms of everyday life, we also had a change in the use of different spaces. So there was a feeling that spaces in the city, such as cafe terraces, were becoming more and more orientated towards tourists rather than locals. So there were a lot of bars, notably in the Rambla, where it became more and more difficult to just get a coffee or a beer because they wanted to sell, of course, full meals to tourists who were going to pay much more money. So the use of everyday space also became contested in Barcelona. And the signs of this began to multiply as time went on, and we got a discourse emerging of tourism phobia in the city. So more and more people were saying, we need to get rid of the tourists because this is bad for the city. And so we have a situation where Barcelona is caught on the horns of a dilemma between tourism as a source of wealth and residents increasingly complaining about the effects of tourism. So we see a changing and dynamic relationship between tourism, culture, and Barcelona, going from the 1992 Olympics, which very successfully put the city on the global map, through the Gaudí year in 2002, which was a very successful cultural tourism event, to the Forum in 2004, which I would argue is really the turning point in this relationship, and an increasing number of signs of discontent among local citizens in relation to tourism. And most recently, the new plan for tourist accommodation, which has gone now through 2 iterations, the first limiting hotel accommodation, and the most recent bringing in stringent controls on sharing economy accommodation, Airbnb, in other words, in the city. So there have also been policy reactions to this changing relationship. One of the things that we did when I was at Fundació Interarts was we developed a tourism monitor for the municipality at that time, but it was taken over by Turisme de Barcelona in the early years of the new millennium. But interestingly, this monitor has been continued right up until before the pandemic. So it provides a very, very interesting picture of how sentiment has developed in Barcelona over the years. When you see the information that is currently put out about this research, they only show the data from 2007. So when you see it, it usually looks like a picture, a slightly different picture. It looks like the relationship between tourism and the city was developing in a positive way up until around 2013, 2014, when people began to say we've had enough tourism, to reaching a point in 2016, so very neatly coinciding with the invention of the term overtourism, where there were more people saying we should limit tourism than there were saying we should attract more tourists. So it seems to fit very neatly with this kind of over-tourism discourse. But in fact, if we look at where we were when we started the monitor in 2005, at that time, the sentiment was also fairly positive. But in 2006 and 2007, the sentiment got very much more negative. And this was because of the growth in the economy up until 2007. And I'll come back to this point in a minute. So what we see over the longer term is a general decline in the number of people saying that tourism is beneficial for Barcelona, although we should underline that it's still nearly 75% of the population saying that tourism is beneficial. So it is more about the trend than the absolute figures. And we also see a declining satisfaction with tourist contact. When we started this research in the first couple of years, we measured people's social class as well. And interestingly, this was something that was dropped from the research in subsequent years. But what we found in those early years was that the people who were complaining most about tourism were people from the higher socio-economic classes. So this is an interesting illustration that the debate is not uniform. It depends on your position relative to tourism. People working in tourism, of course, are more positive, but also it's a class debate. So people in the high socio-economic classes who are not dependent on tourism will generally be more negative than other people. We also see a decline in contact with tourists in recent years. So people are apparently avoiding tourists because tourism has been growing, but people have less contact with tourists. So people have actively been avoiding tourists in the city. And Kathleen Scharf has done some interesting research where she's talked to residents and tourists about how much they like being with each other. And there's a small minority of residents who say they don't want to meet, well, there are less people who want to meet tourists than there are who say, well, I would quite like to share my everyday life with you. So there's a difference in terms of the local population, in terms of their willingness to interact with tourists, but it's also very clear that tourists are keener to meet the locals than the locals are to meet tourists. So this is clearly a feeling on the side of the locals rather than on the side of the tourists. Through all of this, cultural tourism remains a desired form of tourism. There is even a slight upward trend to 2015. But interestingly, this question, along with a few other questions about culture, were dropped from the survey because it was no longer politically acceptable to talk about promoting tourism after 2015. So cultural tourism also dropped from the survey. And this change in attitudes to tourism was, I would argue, about a lot more than just tourism, because there was a lot more going on in the city in the last few years, most notably the Catalan independence debate. But there were also a lot of other issues that people were out on the street demonstrating about. Rising rents, rising prices, particularly electricity, which is a big issue at the moment. Some other people were also protesting directly against big investment companies because they saw that it was the investment companies who were driving the supply of Airbnb rather than the individual tourists. So there is a very complex debate emerging about the nature of development in Barcelona as a whole, not just about tourism. But interestingly, one of the side effects of the independence debate is that the tourist economy of Barcelona has been picked up as a means of projecting the argument. So people were protesting in front of the Sagrada Familia because they knew that those pictures would be picked up by the global media. And also, if you blockade the airport, you make sure that foreign tourists and also foreign businessmen get your message as well. So tourism has also, and cultural tourism through the Sagrada Familia, has also become embroiled in these debates. We shouldn't forget that there are also other forms of mobility affecting Barcelona, not just tourism, but also notably Erasmus students. There are also plenty of those in Girona, but also expats like myself turning up in Barcelona. And expats usually have more money than the local population, so they can afford to pay more for property. So that drives property prices up, it drives rental prices up, and as we can see, there has been a significant growth in the foreign population in Barcelona since the millennium. And that is also, as Augustin Cacola-Gant has argued in the case of Barcelona, transnational gentrification has been key in pushing up prices and rental prices as well. So there have been all sorts of different forms of mobility, not just tourism, affecting Barcelona. And it's interesting, if you start to put these different factors next to each other, then you see, for example, that the sentiment about Barcelona reaching its limit to accommodate tourism correlates very closely, not necessarily with the number of tourists, but with the rental prices in Barcelona. So although tourism becomes framed as the issue in Barcelona, in fact there are lots of different things that are affecting people's sentiment. So if you look at some of these variables and the relationship between them, then you see, interestingly, that GDP, economic growth, is negatively correlated with the idea that Barcelona should attract more tourists. So as the economy grows, people are less, or they are more negative about tourism. And I suppose, in a way, that's logical, because as tourism grows and the economy grows, then people say, well, we don't need tourism anymore because we've reached a better standard of living. So paradoxically, tourism growth, by contributing to economic growth, contributes to its own to negative feelings against tourism, because as people become more wealthy, then they become more anti-tourist. There is a very strong positive relationship between the number of tourists measured in tourist overnights and people saying Barcelona has reached its limit of tourism. So that is fairly logical, and that fits very nicely with a kind of over-tourism discourse. But tourist overnights are more strongly correlated with rental prices. So growing tourism helps to push up the price of rental accommodation. And rental prices are very strongly correlated with this idea that Barcelona is reaching its limit of tourism. And interestingly, rental prices are even more strongly correlated with the percentage of foreigners living in Barcelona. So it's not just the tourists who are pushing up the rental prices, but also these other mobile populations that are arriving in Barcelona. And there's been an interesting analysis of what Blanco Romero et al. Call the housing rent bubble, which is related to these rising rental prices. And it is by all means not just related to tourism. Tourism is the last thing that they mention in driving up rental prices. It's increasing property values, it's changing lifestyles, it's a limited supply. In a city like Barcelona, you can't increase the housing supply very easily. There's very importantly, there is a lack of public rental housing, there is a lack of rent control, and all of these things together are pushing up rents quite considerably. And what we are seeing, I would argue, related to all of these different factors, is an increasing integration of urban functions. And so tourism, which in historic cities like Barcelona used to be limited to a fairly clearly defined area of the city with hotels and with cultural attractions, is now becoming a much more diverse picture. And most significantly, the growth of Airbnb and other types of accommodation is enabling tourism to move out of the previously well-defined tourist enclaves into the everyday spaces of the city. So this idea of Airbnb, that you can live like a local in places like Barcelona, means that we now have a live like the local city where tourists can be everywhere and where local services are now orientated not just towards the local population but also towards tourists. So we see in cities like Barcelona and Amsterdam the number of ice cream shops, the number of waffle shops increasing exponentially, and the number of cheap food shops aimed at locals decreasing. So this means that the delimitation of the tourist city, of the tourist sector, becomes much more difficult to maintain. And so making policies for this kind of situation is also much more complex. It's not just about tourism policy, it's about policy for the whole city. It's more than just a tourism issue. So tourism is often picked up as a problem because it's often high profile, particularly in the areas where tourists are present in large numbers, and it's also visible. But things that are less visible, like rising rents, like this slow change in the function of shops and public spaces, is not so picked up in the discourse. The problems that we often see integrated in this discourse about tourism also stem from this drive to increase the number of tourists as a way of stimulating the economy. So the idea is to just get more tourists rather than thinking about how to get higher quality tourists, higher spending tourists. So increasing numbers is seen as a good thing by policymakers. The commodification of culture is an issue which is part of this whole debate. And the growth of tourism has been enabled by neoliberal policies in cities like Barcelona, which have, for example, got rid of rent controls, left things to the market, and so by leaving things to the market, the city has basically abdicated from its role as policymaker. And things have happened which have been undesirable, but they've been happening because they've been allowed to happen. So the Barcelona model has broken down because it no longer provides the kind of benefits that its citizens want from the model. It was very successful when it was growing the economy and providing more jobs in the 1990s. Since the early 2000s, it has not been providing the benefits that people want at the same scale. So there are a range of problems that are related to tourism which are combined in this idea of over-tourism. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think the term is particularly appropriate in this context. And the situation that we now face is even more complex because we are affected by the pandemic. Barcelona is no exception in that respect. Basically, Barcelona, just like any other major city, emptied of tourists, which was nice for people for a while to be relieved of the tourist pressure. But of course, after a while, you need the tourists back for the economy, but also just for the everyday liveliness of public space, of cultural institutions, and all these other things. So the big question now is what is going to happen with cultural tourism or with tourism in general in cities like Barcelona and other cities as well. Well, if we take the basic forecast from the UNWTO about what is going to happen to tourism in general, then we can predict that we will be back to 2019 levels of tourism in 2024. And that is already the indication that has been given by the early figures on tourism in 2021 in Barcelona. So we're more or less on track to be back where we were by 2024, 2025. So the message is we don't have long to think about this because within 3, maybe 4 years, we'll be back to the same numbers that we were in 2019 that people were complaining about. So we really need to think about what kind of things can be done to address these issues. We wrote a report for Barcelona on this relationship between cultural policy and tourism, which I think is fairly crucial, certainly in terms of cultural tourism, but I think in terms of tourism as a whole in cities like Barcelona. And that report included a number of ideas about making a more positive relationship between culture and tourism. Of course, it's been overtaken by the pandemic to a certain extent, but I think many of the ideas which are contained in that report are still relevant. And we also see some cities taking direct action against what they often see as the villain of the piece, which is Airbnb. So cities like Barcelona and Amsterdam have been instituting more and more controls on Airbnb, and this has led to a decline in Airbnb listings up to 75% in Amsterdam, also I think in Barcelona now. So there are signs that you can control Airbnb, at least in terms of the number of Airbnb properties. But the question is whether this will be really effective, because you can have 75% less Airbnb listings, but you have to ask yourself, what kind of listings are they? Are they the listings which are being run by institutional investors, by commercial companies, or are they the listings which are being run by private individuals in their own homes who no longer find it viable to do those things with increasing regulation? And I think this will be a very interesting point to watch going forward. A colleague of mine in Amsterdam has suggested that probably it won't change the situation too much. So I think there are a number of ways forward that we need to think about. Of course, cooling the property market is essential, not just for reducing the attractiveness of Airbnb, but also in making housing affordable for all. We need to think about more sustainable ways of developing accommodation, and we need to support local businesses. There are some good examples that we talk about in the report, highlighting local shops, traditional businesses, and finding ways of supporting them economically so that you reduce this replacement of local shops with global chains. And really what we need to think about doing is how to highlight not just the global icons of culture, but also what we call in the report the extraordinary everyday of local cultural life, which at the end of the day I think is what really attracts people to cities like Barcelona, and certainly what produces the atmosphere of those cities. So I think we need to think about this pretty quickly, because one of the indicators of the level of tourism is the Primark queue in Barcelona, and that reappeared very, very quickly. As soon as the travel restrictions were eased a bit, the foreign tourists were back and they were shopping at Primark, which of course is not just a sign of tourist pressure, but it's also a sign that people are spending their money with global chains and not with local businesses. So this is the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about. And we need to be providing more positive models of cultural and creative tourism to replace this globalized commodification. So we need to develop a much more holistic creative place-making approach, not a tourism marketing approach, but a means of making places attractive for everybody, not just for tourists. Making places good to live in so that you also attract tourists as a side effect rather than as a direct effect of policy. So shifting from the pure consumption of culture to the co-creation, the production of culture with tourists. So that's all that I wanted to say this morning. There's a lot more stuff on this on my website and on my ResearchGate page, so if you're interested in cultural tourism in Barcelona and those kind of things, you can find a lot more information there. But thank you very much for your attention.
Moltes gràcies, Greg Richards, per la teva intervenció. Les persones que ens segueixen en streaming poden fer les seves preguntes en el xat, que també seran ateses, i els que estan aquí presents, la coordinadora, a la que donem les gràcies també per l'organització de l'acte, la Mireia Pasqual, té un micro a disposició de la sala per si voleu fer preguntes o intervencions o posar una mica en discussió aquest discurs que ha sigut molt centrat en el tema, diguem-ne, de Barcelona, però també que planteja algunes paradoxes interessants. El debat serà conduït per la doctora Sílvia Olet, directora de la Càtedra de Polítiques Culturals de la UNESCO.
So I say it in English also, so for the ones that are following in streaming, if you want to just write your questions on the chat, we're going to transmit it to Professor Richards, and and the ones joining here also, if you have any question, any reflection that you want to share with us, we have a micro, so we can just pass the micro and let us know.
Si alguien quiere hacer preguntas, es que no lo hemos dicho en español, que también está conectado, pues puede a través del chat del YouTube puede hacer las preguntas o intervenir en el debate. En este momento empieza el debate Gracias.
Okay. So, any question here in the room? I see some of. Okay. So first, you raised hand at the same time. So maybe we're going to start here, and then.
I read a really interesting expression, touristification of culture. I read a really interesting expression, touristification of culture. May you explain a little this kind of idea or concept, please?
Yeah, I think the basic issue is who culture is being produced for. So basically, touristification of culture implies that you are producing culture for tourists, whereas what you ideally would like to do is to produce culture for everybody. I mean, if tourists want to consume culture, that's fine. But the problem really emerges when the culture is being produced for tourists and therefore becomes divorced from its local context.
Okay, we have another question. Yeah, before, if you want to present yourself.
Okay, well, hello, good morning, and good morning, Professor. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a PhD student in tourism. This is actually kind of like a reflection, but also a question to you, because I'm worried about if one of the main problems nowadays related to cultural tourism is the fact that are we actually receiving cultural tourists? Because nowadays we have influencers, we have social media exposure, we have we have a lot of exposure. So should we be concerned about what type of tourists are cultural destinations receiving, and how the providers, in this case, museums, in this case, for example, because we have a lot, how can they tackle this? Because if I'm not if I'm only just for the picture, of course I'm gonna be a negative effect into the tourist that actually wants to either see, appreciate, or just even listen, you know? So this is a reflection and a question. How can we tackle, should we be concerned about this? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's very interesting because it relates to this debate about the size of the cultural tourism market. And in the book, Rethinking Cultural Tourism, I present an analysis of this idea that cultural tourism is 40% of global tourism, because this was originally a kind of off the cuff remark by somebody at UNWTO to a journalist, which was then picked up and used by lots of people because it was convenient. I mean, we do now have some empirical evidence to back that idea up, but of course it depends on how you define cultural tourism. So there is a big difference between cultural tourism defined as people visiting cultural sites and people traveling because they are motivated by culture. If you look at the number of people, the proportion of tourists visiting cultural sites, then it does match this 40% figure fairly closely. We have a lot of data from different countries, and it's around about 40%, in wherever you look. On the other hand, if you look at how many of those people are motivated by culture, say they're saying, yes, I came here because of a specific cultural attraction or to do something cultural, it's only about 5 to 10%. So there are far fewer cultural tourists using a motivational definition than using a definition based on visiting cultural attractions. So that's one thing we have to bear in mind. And the other thing is, of course, that our definition of culture is very, very wide. So it depends on what you mean by culture. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the FC Barça Museum is a museum. So everybody who goes on the stadium tour to Barça visits the museum, so therefore they're a museum visitor. Would we call that a cultural visit? I think we could have an interesting discussion about that, and of course supporters of Barcelona would say, yes, of course Barca is culture, but it may not accord to everybody's definition of a cultural visit.
Maybe it could be also religious tourism, because for
Yes,
some of them
yes.
it could be also religion. So we have two questions in the chat, one from Gerardo Pereira from Portugal. He's asking, could all types of cultural tourism convert to creative tourism in terms of numbers and visitors? And what could be the consequences of just turning all this huge amount of visitors into creative tourists?
Yes, it's a good point. I don't think we could turn all of those cultural tourists into creative tourists. You might be able to turn a small percentage of those cultural tourists into creative tourists, but it won't solve the problem overall. Of course, as people travel more and they encounter more interesting elements of culture, the more likely they are to get interested in how culture works and the creative processes behind it. So I think there is a relationship between cultural tourism and creative tourism, but creative tourism is a relatively small niche, and you would also need to think about other niches. I mean, we've mentioned religious tourism, you have gastronomic tourism, all of these kind of things. So cultural tourism is one possibility, but there are a number of others as well.
Then we have another question from Anca Tudorico, I think from Romania. So what would you consider to be the first essential step in developing cultural tourism in a place where people don't appreciate their heritage?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I think the key to people's appreciation of heritage is to provide some kind of understanding of how heritage links to them. I mean, heritage is usually produced in a place where it has a clear relationship to the local context. So people in Catalonia understand about Catalan culture, but if you arrive from Romania or Finland or the United States, you don't understand that context. So there is a job to do, if you want tourists to understand your heritage, there is a job to do in terms of interpreting that heritage and also linking it to the tourist. So what are the links between this heritage and somebody who comes from elsewhere? And this is where, of course, European history can play a very important role, because monasteries were linked to each other. People traveled around, and culture was spread by the monks and by religious pilgrimages and all these kind of things. So one can very often link places in that way. But there are also other links that you can make. But in order to do that, you have to think like a tourist as well. And this is often difficult for the people who are managing heritage. They often find it difficult to get out of their view of heritage as something to be conserved and protected, and to ask the question, well, why would this be interesting for somebody who's never been here before, who knows nothing about the culture. And this is where universal values become important as well, because there are universal values that can be used to link people together. Of course, one of the things that we've seen in the growth of heritage in recent years is the role of nostalgia. So people have a nostalgia for the past, and heritage attractions are usually very good at playing on that nostalgia because it applies to everybody. Everybody has a nostalgia about some past. Not everybody has a nostalgia about the same past in the same way, but they have a relationship to the past. So you can use those kind of links to give people an appreciation of heritage and to develop new heritage attractions as well.
We have still another question on the chat. So Michael O'Regan asks if the problems of mass cultural tourism can be solved by the phrase overtourism and the associated studies, or if we should have, or we should develop more holistic quality of life studies over long periods of time.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's really the crux of the matter, is that over-tourism has been studied by tourism scholars, by and large, who look at tourism. And very often, the wider context, and particularly the historical context, is not taken into account. And when you look at this in a contextualized way, in a historical way, as I've tried to do in the case of Barcelona, one comes to different conclusions about causes and therefore about potential solutions. You know, I would argue that the most important thing to do is to reinstitute protection for people in rental accommodation so they don't get pushed out by companies like Airbnb. But that has nothing to do with tourism. But by adopting more holistic policies, you also affect tourism. So I think that's a very important point.
Do you have more questions in the room or in the chat, or yeah?
Thank you very much indeed. It's open, yeah. I just want to focus on the museums. And as you know, during the pandemic, you are faced with at least I call it the phenomenon that is called virtual tours and in the museums. I want to know about your opinion. Is it helpful to attract, to encourage the cultural tourists to visit the museum in person, or no? They're not now. They prefer after COVID situation. They prefer still in the home and visit by social media and virtual.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. When in the early phases of the pandemic, I was supposed to be teaching in Bergamo in Italy, which is a very similar university to this one, but also with a nice historic campus. So that was a shame. I had to do my lectures online. One of the things that I asked the students to do was to take virtual tours of museums and other cultural sites to assess their experience and to compare those to the experiences that they had in real life, offline experiences. And it was very interesting that we found that some museums were a lot better than others at providing virtual experiences, but most were not that good. Some of them were just basically pictures that you could look at and that was it. So the virtual experiences that we have, certainly at the moment, are still not up to the quality and the kind of engagement that we would expect of a live experience. And I think it will be some time before we get to that point. But I think museums now have a much better appreciation of what virtual environments and online information can do for them. And one of the important things that it can do for them is to engage with different audiences in different places very easily. So people don't have to come to the museum to find out more about what's in the museum, what the mission of the museum is, and all these kind of things, which arguably will make them more likely to visit in future. So it will be very interesting in the next 2 or 3 years to see how museum visits develop and whether we get some indication of this effect of people wanting to travel but also wanting to visit those places they haven't been able to visit in recent years. So I don't think that virtual visits will replace offline visits, but they do have the capability to enhance the quality of eventual live visits, also because people will then have more background about the places they are visiting.
We still have time for another question, even online, or okay.
Good morning. Thank you for being here, for traveling here and doing your presentation in person. After the pandemic, there has been a forced deacceleration on the consumption of culture around the world. So my question is, as you observe a bigger panorama than most of us, has there been any change in the paradigm? Have we learned anything as cultural managers or managers of cultural tourism on the way we present or we deliver the product? Has there been any major shift? Have we learned something out of it?
Well, I think because of this growth in virtual and hybrid environments, there will be a lot of things for cultural tourism managers to think about in terms of how they link virtual experiences and live experiences. That's something that we will be investigating in the next year or so with a project we're doing for the World Leisure Organization, for example, trying to see how these hybrid experiences are developing in different cultural events around the world. But I think it's also given museums a chance to reflect on their own role. One of the interesting effects in Barcelona, for example, was that with the disappearance of international tourists, the museums had to find new ways of engaging with the local population. So if there were no tourists or no international tourists, then La Pedrera was getting school kids and people from Catalonia as opposed to international tourists. I mean, it could never replace the 75% of visits accounted for by international tourists, but it's a very important base that most cultural attractions have to work from. And so it gave those people a sense of reconnection with their local audience. And that's very important because without that connection, you get an increasing touristification of cultural resources.
Okay, I would like also to share a reflection with you, not a question exactly, but I was just taking some notes. And one of the things that has been mentioned and also asked about is about the engagement of local people and how local people deal with tourists or meet tourists in the cultural sites and spaces. And in Barcelona, I know that there is this Barcelona Declaration on, the name is Better Places to Live, Better Places to Visit, and it refers to the concept of permanent and temporary residence, which is very difficult to, so it's easy to understand for me, but it's very difficult to apply or to see how we are going to develop this. And thinking how we can apply this concept, I was also thinking, and you mentioned about the managers. So who are the managers of cultural tourism? Because I think that sometimes we have also like this connection between cultural institutions or cultural managers and tourist managers. And some of the facts you presented were studies done from the tourist perspective, but not from the cultural perspective. So I don't know how to put together all these things to try to improve a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting, because the report that we did for the UCLG together with Lenia Marx had a specific element within it, which was a discussion in Barcelona with people from the cultural sector and the tourism sector about how to link cultural policy and tourism policy together. And it was clear that people in the room didn't talk to each other that often, if at all. But there was evidence of some kind of a shared willingness to deal with this gap, if you like. And so in that report there are a number of ideas on that. The idea of temporary citizens is an interesting one, because this originated in Barcelona as part of the tourism policy for 2017 to 2020, which was drawn up by, among other people, Albert Arias, and he, I think, came up with this term. But as other people have since commented, the idea of temporary citizens is very interesting, but the operationalization of the concept is very difficult, because it implies that everybody who comes to the city is in some way a citizen. So you have certain rights as a citizen, but you also have certain duties. And of course, one of your duties should be to respect and care for other people and for the fabric of the city, just like you would, your own home. But actually getting people to accept everybody who comes to the city as a citizen is much more delicate, because there are still problems of conflicts between different groups within the city. There are some people who are not keen on having certain other people in the city or in their space. And so the idea of temporary citizens is in the policy document, but it has not yet been implemented. And I think this is a very challenging thing for cities like Barcelona to actually do.
Agradecer a las personas que han estado conectadas, a los presentes en la sala. Este 10 de enero que hemos estado dentro de esta nevera, con las puertas abiertas por cuestión de la pandemia, con una temperatura también, digamos, de principios del siglo XIX, cuando no había calefacción, pero que evidentemente eso se agradece por la voluntad y por las ganas de estar presentes. Paso la palabra a mi compañera. Muchísimas gracias a todos.
So we're reaching the end of this session. We have some messages on the chat. Thank you for the intervention and congratulations. Saying congratulations. Thank you very much. If you want, we can just go through them. So again, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you to the ones that are here in Girona and to the ones that
the
connected
brave
online.
ones.
Yeah, the brave ones.
Or the stupid ones, depending on the result.
So it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much to all of you, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Un pequeño recordatorio para los estudiantes del máster. Esta tarde tienen una sesión con el profesor Richards, y los miembros de investigación del laboratorio multidisciplinar en investigación turística, mañana por la mañana en la sala de dirección del primer piso de la facultad tenemos una reunión del grupo de investigación con el profesor Richards. ¿De acuerdo? Gracias.
Thank you.
Tinc una reunió, a les 3 sí que seré a classe. No sé, volem anar a dinar tots dos?
Sí,
Demà sí que em puc quedar.